These are the moves I would make if I needed to save my fantasy roster as we approach week 4 of the fantasy season, whether it's buying low on players through the trade market or looking for last minute streaming options at quarterback and tight end. This is what you guys can do if you need to save your fantasy season. All right, my number one trade target going into week 4 of the season is easily Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants, coming off of a very porous fantasy performance in week 3, 3.3 fantasy points, had 7 targets, just 2 catches, 13 receiving yards, 3.3 fantasy points. Now, yeah, he had 7 measly, awful, off-target targets from Russell Wilson, and we know now going into week 4 that Russell Wilson is not the starting quarterback. It is now going to be rookie Jackson Dart, and this is still a tough stretch overall. Outside of week 5 against the Saints, the next upcoming games for the Giants will be the Chargers, the Eagles, the Broncos, the Eagles again, then the Niners. This is a really, really tough stretch. So I think there's a couple things going on here. I don't know if all fantasy managers are necessarily looking at Jackson Dart as just like, an automatic upgrade at quarterback that's going to save the Giants season. And so far, we kind of have a mixed bag overall in terms of production for Neighbors early here on the season. And then I still think we just have some people looking at this as like, I don't know if just in general this is going to get better at all for the Giants as we start to approach the midpoint of the season. But what we have to understand is even through this upcoming tough stretch, Neighbors is a player with just extreme talent, upside at all times. This is a player that if the fantasy manager in your league is feeling low on him, you have to try and get him on your roster. If you can turn Neighbors into a flex option, that would just be literally the best case scenario. Now, I know that a lot of people understand like Malik Neighbors is still, a first round type talent in terms of where he went in fantasy drafts. Are not going to be willing to move off of him. But if you guys have managers in your leagues who are feeling low on Neighbors or low on the Giants in general after that awful week 3 performance, even though I know Russell Wilson's been benched and everything, not everybody is completely in on Jackson Dart as a starting quarterback. If you guys can strike, get Neighbors on your team. This is a player who has the talent to play through some really bad quarterback play and even some tough matchups coming up as the season starts to progress here. And this is a pretty strong strength of schedule for the fantasy playoffs for the Giants, Commanders, Vikings, and Raiders. Not the worst defenses there, but certainly some defenses that haven't been great against the wide receiver position for the most part. So once again, I don't need to break this down extensively. If you guys have the opportunity to strike for Neighbors and buy him low, it could absolutely save your fantasy season. Speaking of stud wide receivers, we know that CeeDee Lamb is set to miss some amount of time. The amount of time is a little unclear here as he's dealing with that ankle injury. And I have seen CeeDee Lamb come up in a lot of trade discussions for you guys out there in terms of trade questions that I've gotten. I've seen CeeDee Lamb pop up a little bit more than I was actually expecting, because I think most CeeDee Lamb owners, would be in the boat of just wanting to hold on to him, even though he had 0 fantasy points in week 3 and is now dealing with this ankle injury. Hasn't been practicing this week. Once again, we don't know if this is going to be like something at the time of recording this that turns into an IR stunt. He's doubtful going into week 4. I have him listed just as out. I don't think he's going to play in week 4. Maybe by some miracle he does, but I'm going to say just go ahead and bank on CeeDee Lamb at least being out in week 4. But that's kind of part of what I want to get at here. Like, yes, he could miss up to 4 games. The Cowboys have discussed, potentially putting him on IR. We've also seen like he might just miss a week or 2. I mean, this is one of the toughest wide receivers in all of football. Don't forget, he had multiple injuries last year and played through them after getting a big contract without Dak Prescott healthy and on the field. CeeDee Lamb played through multiple injuries last year and still finished as a top 8 fantasy wide receiver in full PPR. This is one of the very best wide receivers in all of the NFL and all of fantasy football. 18 or more fantasy points through the first 2 games of the season. If you guys can go out and strike and buy low on CeeDee Lamb right now, absolutely do it, especially if you already have a good wide receiver room and you can add CeeDee Lamb to your wide receiver room. It could be absolutely a season-altering move for your guys' fantasy rosters. I don't even care if he ends up missing 4 games. If you guys have the opportunity to get CeeDee Lamb on your roster, don't overthink it. You should absolutely be buying low on star-studded players like this when they are hurt, and we know it's not a serious injury. I'm not saying that ankle injury is not serious or anything necessarily, but we know this isn't, an injury that's going to keep him out like 10 games or the entire season or something. When he's back, this is going to be a player you can plug in every single week and know exactly what to expect in terms of fantasy production. If you guys can buy low on CeeDee Lamb, absolutely do so right now. And speaking of wide receivers missing games, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs is set to be back in the next 3 weeks after serving his 6-game suspension. And I think this is once again one of those opportunities. Like, I've seen Rashee Rice come up in a lot of trade discussions, be a player that's been brought up in a lot of your guys' questions in terms of trades. And yeah, it's a great time to buy low on Rashee Rice. When we see injuries, players serving suspensions, like, fantasy managers, a lot of you guys just don't have patience. Maybe not you guys specifically watching this video, but a lot of people out there just don't have the patience. Like, I can't do it anymore, especially if they're 0-3 or 1-2, whatever it may be. And like, they feel like their season is lost and they're holding on to players they can't put into their lineup. Those are the teams you want to go after and try and trade for guys like Rashee Rice or CeeDee Lamb, because when Rashee Rice is back and on the field after the suspension is served, he's going to be the clear-cut number one wide receiver here. And the Chiefs absolutely need him. Like, I know Xavier Worthy's missed some time. He will be somewhat of a factor. Hollywood Brown has done some stuff, I guess, through the first 3 weeks of the season. And then Tyquan Thornton has stepped up to a degree as well. But I don't need to say a whole lot here. You've seen this Chiefs offense this year. You need Rashee Rice, who averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game last year, was a top 30 wide receiver in his rookie year with over 930 receiving yards and 7 receiving touchdowns. Before, he got hurt last year in week 4, he had 17.3 or more fantasy points in every game. Rashee Rice is going to be very productive, especially if you guys can go out once again and turn a player like this into a flex option for you and keep a wide receiver 1 or 2 in your starting lineup that you guys are confident in. That is exactly what you guys want to do. If Rashee Rice has a buy low opportunity in your league, absolutely go after him before we get too close to week 7 of the season. Moving to some running backs that I would try and buy low on. Let's start with TreVeyon Henderson of the New England Patriots. And I know I talked about TreVeyon Henderson like after week 1, and it hasn't really worked out since week 1, just 7.7 fantasy points this past week, but he did lead the team in rushing attempts in week 3 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And moving into week 4 in the midpoint of the season, I still believe this is TreVeyon Henderson's backfield to run away with, especially after last week. Ramondre Stevenson had 2 lost fumbles, not one, and both of those fumbles were lost fumbles. The opposing team recovered them. And Antonio Gibson had a lost fumble. I really believe just kind of the coaching atmosphere here under Mike Vrabel, they are going to start turning to TreVeyon Henderson and giving him more opportunities. This doesn't mean a whole lot, but he has been seeing the most work in terms of the starters in practice going into week 4, according to reports. You can always take that, with a grain of salt. But I think between that and leading the team in rushing attempts, we're already starting to see this start to kind of come to surface. And I don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but the schedule is pretty enticing here over the next couple of weeks. Panthers, not an awful run defense like they were last year, at least through the first 3 games of the season, but they're kind of ranked there right in the middle. Then they get the Bills, the Saints, the Titans. This is a good stretch. It gets a little tougher after that. They get the Browns and Falcons at home, but still, Henderson is one of these players that just at any moment could absolutely run away with this backfield, especially if we see an injury to Stevenson or Gibson. But ultimately, I think just the overall play right now by Stevenson and Gibson is just going to allow Henderson naturally to take over this backfield. So, he hasn't scored more than 11.1 fantasy points in a game thus far on the season, 7.7 or less in the last 2 games. Go buy low on him now before the breakout potentially happens. The other running back in that matchup will be Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers, and I think he is a good buy low after having just 9.6 fantasy points in week 3. Still had 17 rushing attempts, 73 yards on the ground, 3 targets, 2 catches, and 3 receiving yards. He has popped up on the injury report, limited with a calf injury, so monitor that, but that could also be something that ends up helping you guys in trade negotiations, potentially. But ultimately here, right, a lower performance in week 3 where we also saw Rico Dowdle get some opportunity and some goal line work and score a touchdown. He had 10 rushing attempts. But for me, I would not be overreacting whatsoever if I'm a Chuba Hubbard owner or worried about him to any degree, because the Panthers were blowing out the Falcons at home. They did not need to throw the football. In the previous 2 weeks, Chuba had 3 or more catches, 5 or more targets because the Panthers were kind of playing from behind. He gets that involvement in the passing game. He also, both his touchdowns on the year are receiving touchdowns, but also they didn't need to put a lot of starters at risk. They were literally blowing out the Falcons, and that's why Rico Dowdle got some more work and ultimately got the goal line work that led to a touchdown. I don't think that's going to be necessarily a consistent thing on the season. So between the injury, the lower performance this past week statistically, the lack of, receiving game this past week, and the fact that Rico Dowdle came in, scored a touchdown, all of that, you might be able to go out and buy low on Chuba in the short term. And it's a great matchup here in week 4. As long as he's good to go, the calf injury doesn't, cause any issues here. This is a great matchup against a Patriots defense that's bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So still think Chuba, a very good running back to own. Plus weeks 5, 6, 7. I mean, look at this upcoming schedule all the way to week 8. Gets the Dolphins, the Cowboys, both at home, 2 very bad run defenses, then the Jets, and then the Bills. So this is a great spot if you guys can go out and buy Chuba Hubbard right now. This is still a player that's going to have a very good fantasy season. Last player I want to talk about in terms of the trade market will be J.K. Dobbins of the Denver Broncos. I know this is going to be kind of a tougher player to potentially buy low on, as he's had 14.8 or more fantasy points in every game this year. He scored a touchdown in every game this year, and he has been the clear-cut RB1 in this backfield. Right now, he is a top 10 running back in PPR scoring. He's averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game. He's literally getting the bulk of the volume. There's really been no RJ Harvey the past 2 weeks, right? But I think that still, I would try to go out and trade for him before week 4, because this could be his best game yet. I mean, he's getting the Cincinnati Bengals, who've given up the second most fantasy points to opposing running backs on the season so far. He's going to have a monster game. Everybody's in on Dobbins this week. I mean, the Broncos are going to have a great week overall, but this is a great spot for Dobbins. He could literally have his first, 20 plus point fantasy day. And after that, I just don't think you guys are going to have an opportunity to trade for him whatsoever. There's always a knock, like Dobbins could always get hurt. That's always been the knock against him when you look at his career. Try and use what you can in terms of trade negotiations here. Ultimately, I would just try to trade for him before week 4 in a smash spot against the Bengals, because I still believe, as I did all offseason long, that this is the true RB1 for the Broncos. If this is a guy you guys can get on your starting roster, even if you need to flex him, if you're in need of an RB2, whatever it is, this is a running back who's going to bring a ton of fantasy value to you. I was in need of a quarterback to stream this week or try to potentially trade for. I would look to Jordan Love as a great buy low candidate. Now, I don't know in terms of the long term how much I necessarily love Jordan Love. No pun intended. And I don't know if he's really going to be floating out there on the waiver wire for all you guys, as he sits at 82% roster. But what I do know, he's on the road here on Sunday Night Football in a prime time spot against the Dallas Cowboys, who are giving up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season. I think easily this will be Jordan Love's best fantasy day yet as we look to week 4. Now, this Cowboys defense is also really bad against the run, so I don't know. Maybe I won't be surprised if they kind of stick to the run game, but the Cowboys have an opportunity at home to keep this game competitive, although they're going up against a much better Packers defense, and I just think this is a spot where Jordan Love can come out, throw for 2 or more passing touchdowns, and maybe his highest passing yard mark on the season yet. He's only hit 292 passing yards in week 2 with 20 fantasy points. I think he will exceed all of those numbers here in week 4. So if you're struggling at quarterback, I know it's been a little rough in terms of quarterbacks lately with guys like, Joe Burrow going down, Jaden Daniels being up in the air, some other names in that field as well, and some of the lower end back end late round quarterbacks just not working out, like Michael Penix and JJ McCarthy, who's also been hurt. Been a weird year of quarterbacks. If you guys need help, you can make a buy low offer for Jordan Love. I would absolutely do it. If he's out there on waivers, I would absolutely pick him up right now and look at him as a solid starter here in week 4. Now, if I needed a true streaming option at quarterback, I would pick up Geno Smith, who sits at 35% rostered at the time I am recording this, coming off of a day where he had 26 fantasy points, gets the Chicago Bears at home here in week 4, who've given up the third most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. This is a great spot for Geno Smith, who was surprisingly a top 12 quarterback so far on the season. I don't know if it's necessarily super surprising. I mean, he just had an awful week 2 against the Chargers, still had 18 fantasy points in week 1, and we get some fluctuation with a quarterback like Geno Smith. I don't know what's, again, in terms of the long term, if I necessarily like Geno Smith, but I think he's one of the best true streaming options at quarterback that you guys can actually run to the waiver wire right now to pick up. 289 passing yards in week 3 against the Commanders, 3 passing touchdowns, and we look here in week 4 at home for the Raiders. This is going to be one of those matchups where both teams are going to be throwing the football. The defenses probably aren't going to be playing great. Both these secondaries give up a lot of overall fantasy points to opposing wide receivers and quarterbacks. This should be a game with a lot of passing volume. I like Geno Smith a lot in week 4. I think he's one of the best true streaming options at quarterback if you guys are in need. All right, if I had to either buy low or stream a tight end who might be out there, I would definitely look to Dalton Kincaid. I talked about this in really like the last 2 or 3 waiver wire videos. It feels like Dalton Kincaid just deserves to be rostered. He sits at 83% rostered, so if you're really lucky, he might be out there floating in more shallow leagues. But once again, similar to Jordan Love here, you might have to go out and buy low, quote unquote, on Dalton Kincaid. But I think this is going to be a tight end you guys can just trust for the rest of the season. As I've said over the past couple weeks, 17.6 fantasy points in week 3, 6 targets, 5 catches, 66 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Now has 2 touchdowns through the first 3 games of the year. I mean, the Bills offense is going to spread the football around a lot. They are going to get the football to a lot of different players. At times that will hurt Dalton Kincaid, but ultimately it looks like he is going to be one of the primary receivers on this team. Although he plays at the tight end position, he is still sitting at 18 total targets on the season, tight end 3 right now in fantasy scoring, and he is the tight end 6 in fantasy points per game. If you guys can get your hands on Dalton Kincaid and you're struggling at the tight end position, I think he is a player who could absolutely help save your fantasy season. All right, if I needed a true streaming option at the tight end position, I would be looking to go add Hunter Henry. Sits at 65% rostered, a little bit higher than I would like for a potential streamer, but he might be out there and available. You might have to buy low on him. I don't love, like, quote unquote, buying low on him because he's coming off of a game where he had 29 fantasy points. So I don't know if it's like a true buy low. Then once again, as much as I like Hunter Henry as one of the best streaming options in fantasy football, you're going to get some fluctuation when it comes to Hunter Henry. We've seen that early in the season. 10 fantasy points, 1.9 fantasy points, 29 fantasy points in week 3. He's not going to score 2 touchdowns every single week, but he does act as a true security blanket for Drake May at the quarterback position. And let's just face it, this is never going to be one of those teams that consistently throws to the wide receiver position, it feels like. So Hunter Henry is a huge recipient of a lot of the targets and receptions for this Patriots offense right now. Patriots at home in week 4 get a great matchup against the Panthers, bottom 10 against the tight end position. Tight end 3 right now in fantasy points per game, tight end 2 overall. This is a player to take a strong look at if you guys are struggling at the tight end position. I know some of those guys were more highly rostered than you might like to see, so here are your desperation streamers at quarterback and tight end if you guys need help in week 4 of this season. Tua Tagovailoa sits about 23% rostered, gets the New York Jets this week at home. It's a good enough matchup. Tua's just always going to be a desperation streamer for me. You might get 18 or 19 fantasy points. You might get something that you really don't like. True desperation streamer. I mean, he threw 2 touchdowns this past week, but only 146 passing yards and an interception. Only got you 13.8 fantasy points. Nothing but a desperation streamer, but looking across leagues, he's out there and available. He's always an option. Just you got to understand what you're rolling with. Matthew Stafford, also always an option. I kind of like this potential game script in week 4 against the Indianapolis Colts. And side note, I'm not considering Daniel Jones like a potential streamer for you guys because he's way too highly rostered. So yeah, if you guys can stream Daniel Jones, go get Danny Dimes and do it. But he's just way too highly rostered at this point in the season for me to even mention in this type of video. But yeah, Stafford has at least 2 passing touchdowns in the past 2 weeks. He needs to get more passing yards in a game script to to have a good fantasy stat line. I do think that could happen at home against the Colts this week, like it did in week 2 against the Titans, where he had 18 fantasy points. But this past week, threw 2 touchdowns, but only 196 passing yards and an interception, only 14 fantasy points. He is a player you can always at least consider if you need help at the quarterback position. Then call me crazy, but I think Carson Wentz is okay against the Steelers this week. I think it's going to be kind of a weird game, being in Dublin, an overseas game, all of that. But, I mean, he had control of the football last week. No interceptions, no fumbles, 14 of 20, 173 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Only had 15 fantasy points, but the Vikings didn't really need to do anything else against the Bengals. They were absolutely like blowing them out. So Carson Wentz, true desperation streamer option. I know, once again, it's tough at quarterback for a lot of you guys out there. All right, I would just check and see if Evan Ingram is available. He's got his first full practice in yesterday at the time I'm recording this, so that is good news. I don't know exactly what I'm expecting out of Evan Ingram. He sits around 63% rostered, but he gets the Bengals this week. It's a really good matchup. So if you're truly desperate, you could try and pick him up, see what happens, or maybe you're just hurting at tight end. Evan Ingram is a player to maybe stash and see if this is actually going to work out with the Broncos, although the first 3 weeks of the season have not been very encouraging. Brenton Strange will live in the streaming category at tight end, sitting around 30% rostered. He's had 9.9 or more fantasy points in 2 of the 3 games this year so far. The Jaguars wide receiver room looks awful. They're dealing with some injuries right now with Dewami Brown, so maybe there's some more opportunity, as we saw in week 3 in terms of Brenton Strange and his target share. He's always a streaming option if you guys have nothing better out there. Cole Kmet is interesting because Colston Loveland has been dealing with an injury that he sustained this past week. He has not practiced so far this week at the time of recording this. Just 1 catch last week, but it was a touchdown. I don't know. It's not the worst matchup here whatsoever against the Raiders. We already touched on that game a bit. Both teams are going to throw the ball a lot. If you're hurting that tight end, Kmet could be an option this week. Then we don't know if Isaiah Likely is going to play this week. He's been limited in practice throughout the week. But I think if you're hurting that tight end, like he sits around 26% rostered, he is a player you guys could go out and potentially pick up. Stream this week. Cross your fingers. I don't know if I would really want to do that in his first game back from injury, but ultimately, even though the Ravens have an early bye week in week 7, which could hurt the potential status of Likely here, if you're hurting that tight end, I think Isaiah Likely is a player you guys should consider picking up, because could be a player who has fantasy value as the season starts to progress. And then we got Oronde Gadsden of the Chargers. Made his first NFL start in week 3, missed the first 2 weeks of the season dealing with an injury. This is a player who I want you guys to take a strong look at, as Will Dissly's dealing with a knee injury, and Tyler Conklin has not really looked good and was only on the field for 26% of snaps this past week for the Chargers. And we know the Chargers offense right now wants to throw the football a lot, and Gadsden had 7 targets this past week, 5 catches, 46 receiving yards, 9.6 fantasy points. Gets the Giants this week. Maybe you don't start him, but he's a true desperation streamer for sure in week 4, and definitely a player, if you're truly dead in the water at tight end, that you should strongly be taking a look at as we move in to week 4. And there you guys have it. There are the wide receivers and running backs I would buy low on right now to try and save your fantasy season, as well as all the quarterbacks and tight ends you guys may be able to make moves on through the trade market or the waiver wire to help save you in week 4. Don't forget, guys, I'll answer all fantasy football questions in the comments down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 4 of the season, please drop me a comment down below. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you're down there, it does me a huge favor if you guys hit that subscribe button on the way out. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our week 4 fantasy content. We'll have everything that you could possibly need to dominate week 4 of the season on the channel. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.